Petroglyphs, some of the most interesting and mysterious artifacts of the Hohokam civilization. Hiking in city parks is a great way to learn more about them. Recently, we went along on a morning petroglyph hike in Phoenix's South Mountain Park. Hello, I'm Phoenix 11's Ken Lynch. We're at South Mountain Park at the Beverly Canyon Trailhead near 46th Street and Baseline Road. Today, we'll be hiking about 4 miles near the east end of the park, visiting petroglyph sites along the way. It's a hike organized by the Pueblo Grande Museum, a city-owned facility near 46th Street in Washington, where some of the more spectacular Hohokam ruins are preserved. Our guide is Dave Morris, who works at Pueblo Grande.
This is one of our longer hikes. It's probably right close to 4 miles, a little bit more, but not much in the change of elevation and things. It's pretty gradual, so it's rated as a moderate hike. So a nice little loop. See a lot of petroglyphs along the way, and of course we'll probably stop and do a little plant talk too, since by training I'm a botanist. Okay, so I got to throw a little bit of plant stuff in there for you. And then just a quick word on our etiquette again, although most of you have hiked with me before. We're going to be looking at the rock art, and of course one of the main rules is not to touch the rock art with your hands, because the oils and acids in your fingers can actually damage the surface of the rock and degrade the petroglyph that's carved into there. So no touchy-feely on this trip, all right? You can look and take pictures, but no touching them. And if you happen to see a piece of artifact on the ground, a shard or sherd of pottery, for example, you know, everything here in the South Mountain Preserve is protected. So that includes plants, the animals, the rocks, and all the archaeology that's here. So we have to remember that as we're walking through this preserve here, which was, of course, a wonderful gift from the city for us to have to hike in. So a little respect is all we're asking on the hike as we go through here today. The hike we went to Box Canyon, we saw 2 speckled rattlesnakes. Now the hike I took last weekend, we didn't see any snakes. So hopefully we'll get lucky this time.
The point is, we leave them alone.
Yes, and they are protected.
Slowly.
Yeah, and you should be aware that they are around. So again, don't be surprised if you do see one. Okay, well hopefully we'll get lucky, but you never know. Okay, all right?
Our hike starts over level ground, but eventually we gain a little altitude. The Hohokam hiked over this ground for as many as 2,000 years until they faded into history around 1450 AD. It's a brisk walk through some beautiful scenery. It's been very dry the last few years, and the park does show the effects. There isn't much green around. The Hohokam also experienced cycles of drought. They managed to sustain themselves with an extensive canal system. It irrigated tens of thousands of acres of farm fields in the valley and supported as many as 50,000 people. About a mile into our walk, it's time for a botany break.
A good example, because we have our Palo Verde trees here to talk about. And this is the blue Palo Verde, right? Everybody knows blue Palo Verdes. But on the other hand, there are other Palo Verdes here. So right behind us is the yellow Palo Verde, or I know it as the little leaf Palo Verde. And so for botanists, see, it gets tough. When you use common names all the time, it gets confusing. I can say Palo Verde, and somebody's looking at the blue Palo Verde, somebody else is looking at the little leaf Palo Verde. Which Palo Verde are we talking about? 3 different types of Palo Verdes, but green stick, translation of the name, and that's a pretty good description of the tree. It has a nice green bark, so that's where you get the green stick, the Palo Verde name from. And of course, you also know, right, Palo Verde is a state tree of Arizona. Everybody knew that? Okay, that's going to be on the test. All right. And some people say, well, which Palo Verde is the state tree of Arizona? The blue Palo Verde is the one that we usually count as the state tree. Okay. The little leaf behind us is a native as well. The Mexican Palo Verde is kind of a recent import. It doesn't really belong here. So most botanists call it a weed. All right. So 3 different Palo Verdes. Gets exciting. All right. We'll see probably the other 3 main trees in the desert, which will be the ironwood and the mesquite on our trip here today. So we'll identify those for you too, so you know all the trees that way. Okay. Everybody ready? All right. Here we go.
The hike gets a little steeper now, and the trail occasionally narrows. It can also get quite warm. Everybody brought hats and plenty of water. We stopped to rest near an ironwood tree.
It is in the same family, legume or bean family, so the beans were used as food, as were the Palo Verde seeds, and of course the mesquite beans, which were the famous food, the staple of the people here in the early days. They look very similar, so it's hard to tell them apart often. But again, Palo Verdes now we know have green bark, right? So that's a good way to tell them apart. Ironwood typically has a nice gray bark. So you look for that smooth gray bark, tells you it's ironwood. And when you see a mesquite tree, you'll see a brown shaggy bark on the mesquite. So they're kind of like the dogwoods. You know them by their bark. Okay, and these jokes don't cost you any extra. All right. Very heavy wood, all right? A cubic foot of ironwood weighs 66 pounds. You throw that into water, it sinks. So don't make a raft out of this, all right? Not going to get you very far. But it would make a good tool handle, right? So our Hohokam people and the early Pima and other native people that were here used it as tool handle, very hard wood, and they even used it for arrowheads because it's hard enough to actually hold an edge. So not a lot of chert, flint, obsidian here. So ironwood is hard enough to hold an edge for an arrow point. That's a good example of ingenuity. Okay. And before you get mad at me, my background too, I'm half botanist, half Choctaw Indian. Okay, so don't get mad at me. But my dad's full-blood Choctaw. My mom has a little Irish and German in her. So that's how I got interested in the plants here, was through my background of the native people in Oklahoma. Got out here, got my degree in botany, and then kind of got interested in the plant uses of the native people here too. So I'll throw some of that in as we walk along too. Okay, spend a lot of time on the reservation.
Dave, this tree is so dense it must grow very slowly.
Oh yes, most of our desert trees grow real slow because that's a survival factor here. You slow down your metabolism so that you can deal with the heat and the drought conditions here. We got that little rain, just about 3 or 4 days ago, so they're really fast at collecting the water that comes down. So it's pushed out some nice leaves for us to look at here. And you'll notice that some of the very upper branches do have a green tinge to them. So like a lot of our other plants, they do a little bit of that bark photosynthesis, which is why the Palo Verde is green, because it's doing a lot of the photosynthesis through the green bark system. So a lot of our plants, ocotillos and things, will have portions that are green in the bark area that are also doing some of the photosynthesis for the plant.
That's also a water conservation feature of
That's
these
very
plants?
true. Drought deciduous is one of the survivals here to survive. When it gets real hard going, then leaves will be dropped to conserve water, because that's where most of the water is lost from a plant. It's out of the leaf system. You drop all your leaves, then you don't lose any water. But of course, leaves are there for photosynthesis. So how are you going to make your food? Well, if you have some green stuff, some chlorophyll for photosynthesis in your bark system, you can still make enough food to get through the hot, dry summer months. So they call it drought deciduous. Good survival tactic. A lot of plants do that here.
Is that why is it the Mexican Palo Verde that has the real thin, almost needle-like?
Yeah, that's it. The Mexican has a real long leaf stem with the little leaflets on it. Yeah, and they'll drop those, of course, being evergreen trees, they drop leaves all year round, all right? But typically in the drought season, they will drop leaves in greater number to help conserve the moisture. And then they do look like a green stick, Palo Verde, yeah.
Several hundred yards further on, along a narrow trail up a steep canyon, we stop at our first petroglyph panel.
So here's a nice little panel of the petroglyphs, first ones we've seen on our hike here. Number of different designs you'll see there. Some human figures or human-like figures that are called anthropomorphic. And one of the traditions I do here is of the lizard people that came out of the sand world to teach the modern Indian people how to live in the desert. And when they came out of the sand world, they actually lost their tail. They did their job, went back into the sand world, and they grew their tails back again. So here's that regeneration of a body part. So a very powerful animal for that reason. So usually you'll see lizards as power symbols of some kind or another. But often with this third appendage, we call him a lizard man. Some circular designs, just some rectilinear designs there. Petroglyphs are rock carvings. Petro is rock, glyph means carving. So they're actually carved into this rock surface, just etching through that rock varnish, which is patina or patination process that darkens the surfaces of our rocks here. So all you have to do is actually carve through that layer, and you'll show the lighter color of the rock, and that makes them stand out really well. They're just not graffiti. In the first place, look at where we're at. Okay, why would you climb all the way up here just to carve Kilroy was here? All right, because it's not very economical use of your time. And it's pretty intensive work carving with another hammerstone, just another rock to carve these. So probably they did have a meaning, spiritual in nature, we think, in many cases, ceremonial, maybe directional, telling you where to find water, where to find trails, things like that, and perhaps even telling us stories or mnemonic devices, things, how to remember different things that happened. So a lot of possible explanations. And I also say at this point that nobody really knows for sure what these designs mean. So there is a lot of conjecture and some consensus as to what the designs mean. So I'm giving you the benefit of what I've learned from the archaeologists and anthropologists, but also I'm going to combine that with some of my Native American background, some of the people I've talked to on the reservations here, the medicine people, and putting that together, giving you my explanation. No better than anybody else's, but probably no worse than anybody else's either.
Right across the canyon, Dave says, we'll come across our next collection of glyphs.
Nice little grouping here in this little wash system. A lot of the human figures that you'll see here, an excellent deer carving. Over to the left there, you'll see what we call an outline cross. It's a big cross box with a cross on the inside. And a lot of people are suspecting that that's representing the morning star, or maybe Quetzalcoatl, the Mexican god. So excellent designs here. Notice how a lot of them are a lot darker than some of the other ones, and that's one of the ways you can kind of judge the age of petroglyphs is by how much they've darkened, because that patination process begins again as soon as you've done carving. So if they get darker and darker, then they're older and older. The only problem with that is that occasionally we do think they were recarved or repecked, and that would increase the magic or the symbolism in them, and then that would throw your dating process off if you're trying to determine using your color. And then a real nice maze design over here on the spar face.
Way over on the left edge there.
And that's real reminiscent of a lot of pottery and basket designs. So maybe this was a way to preserve some of those designs. Other people have suggested that perhaps they're talking about trails or field layouts, things like that, when they see geometrical layouts like that. So a lot of possibilities.
This newer one up here of what appears to be a deer.
Yes.
It has perspective. Most of just everything we've seen is real flat and two-dimensional.
That's true, and we do see a progression, just as you could look at any school kid and see the progression as they move from first grade drawings on up to a college artist or whatever.
I'm curious about that cross. I don't recall seeing that. Is that a fairly frequently occurring symbol?
We see them several times here in South Mountain and often through the Southwest. So yeah, it is a pretty common symbol actually. There's a little bit of our Indian tobacco right at the base of this rock surface here. So that was one of the plants that was used ceremoniously. So that brings us to another thing that perhaps, we passed a lot of rock surfaces that looked really good. Now, why didn't they do any carvings there? But here they've done carvings. Well, we think there were probably ceremonial reasons to do rock art at a certain spot. Perhaps this was where the power was felt, or whatever the criteria was. And so rock art's only found at selected sites where the shaman or the medicine person would say, this is the site that has the power, let's do the drawings here for whatever purpose. But a little Indian tobacco down there. And it's strong stuff. We have tree tobacco here as well, which will be used in a lot of our ceremonies. So if a native person is collecting tobacco to use in like a sweat or a pipe ceremony, they'll use Indian tobacco or the tree tobacco, which is it's the ancestor of our modern tobacco. That's actually where the tobacco came from. And this is Nicotiana trignophylla, or maybe you learned it as Nicotiana trignophylla, because it names the alkaloid in there, nicotine. And I have smoked this, but I did not inhale.
Occasionally, petroglyphs appear in places other than the usual rock outcroppings or sheltered canyon interiors. These markings are right on the trail, and they have unfamiliar symbols, which makes Dave wonder if they're genuine.
And of course, it's also a challenge because you never know for sure if they're authentic. They do color at different rates depending on how the environment. They believe there's even a little microorganism that helps to make that black coloring on there. So the clay, which has a lot of iron and manganese, lands on that rock. The microorganisms help cement that together, and layer upon layer upon layer that occurs to make that desert varnish or rock varnish. And maybe up to 1,200 years to produce that coloring. Although in the lab they could do it in about 6 months because they throw all the right things at it and it happens pretty quickly. But as the environment changes, if all those things playing a part in there, then so would the rate of coloring. So we can't use it as a real accurate way to judge the age of petroglyphs, but we can get a ballpark figure.
We saw lots of wildlife this day. We spotted this hawk not far from the entrance to Pima Canyon. Lizards scurry around, and this 2-inch grasshopper caused everybody to stop and look. Even black ants captured Dave's attention. He says Hohokam and other Indian peoples use the tiny bits of quartz around the ant holes to make gourd rattles.
So to make it rattle, you got to clean everything out, and then you come down here to the ant hills and you look for these little round pieces of quartz that the ants have brought up out of the earth. And those are gifts to the Indian people to put in the rattle to make them rattle. But of course, when you collect that, you always want to bring a little piece of cookie or candy, because you want to keep the trade. You want to keep the trade going between the ant people. And of course, there are a lot of other stories about the ant people in the Hopi tradition. You know, they're again saying that we're in like the fourth world. And so in one of the recreations of the world, the creator asked the ant people to take the Indian people that believed in the true ways down into their world and keep them safe down there until it was time to come out on the new Earth surface. So the ants took the Indian people down in there, kept them very safe, but they began to run out of food. So the ants gave all the food to the Indian people, didn't eat anything themselves, saved the Indian people. But the ants got hungrier and hungrier, so they kept tightening their belts tighter and tighter, and that's why the ant has a little bitty narrow waist today. Okay, so we really revere the ants and try not to step on them, teach you to be industrious and everything. So kind of neat little animals. They'll harvest saguaro seeds. In some areas, 90% of the saguaro seeds that are produced will be harvested by these guys. So another stumbling block for saguaro propagation.
We cross over a ridge peppered with cholla and into Pima Canyon, a heavily used hiking and mountain biking area. There are a lot of outcroppings of rock along the canyon floor, and here we find one of the more impressive petroglyph panels, framed by the rock around it, complex and very mysterious.
This one lizard guy here that has this big tummy, it looks like, and they call it the Gila bulge. And we see that real commonly in the lizard figures here. And so the biologists think it's actually representing the chuckwalla lizard that lives here, because he's a real big, fat lizard that they may have used for food. It's an iguana lizard. But again, from the Native American standpoint, a lot of people are saying that's not the tummy you're looking at, that's the hole that they emerged through. So you're looking at this figure here, and you're seeing the circle, and that's the hole that he's emerging into this world from. So a couple of different ideas of what that round circle might be, but they call it the Gila bulge.
So there's also kind of wavy lines?
Yeah, a lot of, now, of course, again, we're not sure, but water would be a good explanation. And this, you know, we just passed through a big wash system, and the springs that used to be here would run probably year-round. And so there probably was a lot of water in this area. So water symbols, and you often find petroglyphs around water sources. So a lot of water symbols we think would be done, or maybe in hopes that the springs would run again or the rains would come. You do the carvings as kind of an asking for what you need.
And there's one of those spirals at the very far end that's so frequent.
Sure, that's also again thought to perhaps be a water symbol. There's somebody who wrote a book, Spirals Mean Water, in petroglyphs. Now again, another viewpoint is that again it's indicating an emergence point. So the spiral may be showing the emergence points or vortex. Sedona's got nothing on us. Okay, we got plenty of stuff here.
And this one almost looks modern, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it looks fairly new. Yeah,
teeth.
but that's a real reminiscent of a lot of the pottery designs that we'll see done in Hohokam styles pottery. There's also kind of towards this end, almost like looks like eyes looking at you, and they call it the bear mask. And so maybe a representation of the bear. Of course, in the valley, we know there are bears around, and this year has been pretty good for bears. Been kind of grisly, but here's the bear mask, which again is a healing symbol, power symbol.
And once again, their crosses are up there, and they're a little higher than the others, maybe because they're the stars.
Well, yeah, and that's a possibility. Plus of which, you know, if some of these were for ceremonial or ritual value, you know, who are you drawing them for? And if you're drawing them for the Creator, you want them up higher where you can see them better. So a lot of possible explanations.
A few hundred yards from this site, we find a grouping of people packed high up in rock otherwise barren of glyphs.
But these are the ones they call the dancers. And for sure, anthropomorphic figures, that's what the anthropologists call human-like figures. And they look like they are dancing, in fact. So we believe they maybe are dancing for, because of a good harvest, number one, or in order to obtain a good harvest. So maybe for rain, they're doing a dance, because there was a dance done here in the Southwest as a rain dance. So depicting some kind of celebration, we believe. Or the rock art enthusiasts like to call them the party morphs because of that.
We also find the date 1902 packed into the stone. As with many more recent entries into the rock ledger at the park, it's hard to know if it's genuine. But there is no doubt about these ruins in Pima Canyon, though they're not of the prehistoric variety.
These are the remnants of some of the buildings that the CCC people built when they were doing a lot of the work here.
The Civilian Conservation Corps?
Yes, they did most of the trail work here, and most of the buildings for the picnic areas and stuff were done in those days.
Depression.
That's right. So these are some leftover buildings. Almost all the ramadas that you're going to see here are made by them, but you'll see they're not repaired. The Park Service has chosen not to repair them, but they haven't destroyed them either because they are part of the historic part of Phoenix here.
They're beautiful.
So yeah, a lot of work gone into that. This was actually more like a kind of a barracks area up here, and this was actually the early latrine, which a lot of the hikers actually still make use of, even though it's not hooked up or functional. But
built like a brick, yeah.
There you go. So it's kind of interesting to see the rock work in there, and anytime you see any of that in the park, it's probably done by those early workers that were here.
So, but clearly this is made with just the immediately available material.
That's true, and although we also see areas where they probably quarried some stone, and you'll see areas where the faces have been cleaved by explosion, and then they probably chopped that up to get some block material as well.
It looks almost native, doesn't it?
It does. It looks very nice, and it does blend in, so it's not as obtrusive as it could be.
Yeah, that's really pretty.
Our hike is wrapping up now over ground a little more level near power lines stretching over the park's east entrance. We can't get very close to this last glyph on our tour because it's well off the marked trail.
This is one of the biggest human figures or anthropomorphic figures that we see in the canyon here in South Mountain. And that guy's probably about 4 foot tall or so. And of course you have to pick him out through all the graffiti that's over there now. And this area has kind of been posted as off limits now because of the people scurrying over the boulders and adding their graffiti to that too. So that's kind of a sad addition to the park here. But it's nice to be able to still pick out that large figure. And there are a few other figures around that little mountain outcropping, which is another point we probably should make, that when you do hike here in South Mountain, you want to be aware of the signs and where the trail is posted. To stay on the trail, you need to do that, and that helps preserve the vegetation, and so the park will be here for everybody to enjoy in the future.
What an interesting figure. He almost looks like he's leaping.
Leaping.
Doesn't he?
Well, he does. Maybe the first rocket. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities.
I can't believe I handed you that line.
Okay. Anyway, so we're almost at the end of the trail, so I think everybody's happy to hear that. And, okay.
20 or so minutes later, we're back in the parking lot. The whole hike took about 3 hours. We had only one trail victim who suffered a minor fall. We were wrapped up by 10 a.m., and Dave sent us on our way.
I want to thank you all for coming on the hike with us, and we all made it back. We didn't have any fatalities on this one, so I got a pretty good record. Okay, so I sure appreciate you coming out. If you want to take another hike with us down at the museum, you can always call up and find out when the next hikes are coming up, or get your calendar of events. If I'm going to lead the hike, you'll look for my Indian name, Pun in the Sun, and then you'll know who's leading that one.
If you'd like to find out more about petroglyph hikes, call the Pueblo Grande Museum at 602-495-0901. I'm Ken Lynch for Phoenix 11.